I'm Felicia Day, and I'm the host of the official The Lord of the Rings of Power podcast. In every episode, I'm going backstage for an all-access look at what it took to bring Middle-earth to life. I will be sharing juicy behind-the-scenes stories and processing all the holy crap moments with the members of the cast and crew. So if you want to deep dive into every episode, watch The Rings of Power on Prime Video and listen to all 8 episodes of the official The Lord of the Rings of Power podcast for free on Amazon Music.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be going back to the 17th century, specifically Salem Village in the late 1600s. And we're going to be looking at the early phases and sort of the roots of the Salem Witch Trials. And you know, Chris, the people involved in the Salem Witch Trials there in Salem Village and some of the key personalities we're going to be looking at today, these people were Puritans. And I think when we use the word Puritan and people think of Puritans, they generally don't have a very positive image. You know, you think of someone who dresses in very dark clothes, someone who maybe, doesn't have much of a sense of humor. There's the old quip that a Puritan was a person who had the haunting fear that someone somewhere might just be having fun, and it troubled them. So we're going to be going back and we're going to be looking at these people in the late 17th century and the early stages of the Salem Witch Trial.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned about someone having fun. Well, in the spring and summer of 1692, it was anything but fun that was going on in Salem Village. And I think many of our listeners are probably familiar with the Salem Witch Trials. But what I think is important for us to do is to go back and look at the context in which the Salem Witch Trials actually began. What took place? How did we get to that point? And I really think that the way that this travesty of justice basically occurs is because there were so many different events that were happening in the village, but also outside of the village. In the spring and summer of 1692, you have this frontier war that's going on. We have economic conditions that is causing a divisiveness. There is boredom. There's personal jealousies. And oh my gosh, right at the center of it, it's the church. And Ray, we know that sometimes the church can be the center of some of the most divisive and agonizing conflicts that's known to man. And we find that here in 1692.
Yeah, absolutely. The church is at the center, a church division, I guess we could say, a division within a church and a division within the Salem Village community there in Massachusetts was really at the core of what was going on. Another issue, of course, Chris, that was at the core, you talk about, things that were going on in the society and things that were going on in the larger world. One of the things that I think the Salem Witch Trial does reveal to us is this sort of, at the time, they had a suspicion of women, especially women who did not fall within the guidelines of what a quote unquote good woman was supposed to be like. And I think when we start looking at, who was accused and all that, we're going to see that some of these women, certainly fell outside the normal, at that time, expectations for what a woman was supposed to be. So we are looking at a church. And we're looking at a man by the name of Samuel Parris. And of course, Parris comes from London. He's born in 1673. When Samuel grows up, he's sent to Boston to attend Harvard College. His father dies while he's there, and he inherits a plantation there on the island of Barbados. And ultimately, a hurricane hits Barbados, and most of his property is absolutely destroyed. So he takes 2 of his slaves and he settles in Boston, Massachusetts, where he attempts to become a merchant. And Chris, this sort of begins his journey, a not too terribly long journey, but begins a journey into what would become his central role in the Salem Witch Trials.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that we go back and kind of look at how he did get to Salem Village. One of the things that I found interesting in researching the life of Samuel Parris is that he was the younger son, that there was this eldest son. And as you mentioned, when the father died, the eldest son received land and personal estates and cash, just a lot of possession, a lot of land and a lot of money. And when they're reading the will or whatever's going on, there's 20-year-old Samuel who's listening to his older brother get land after land after land and money after money after money. And finally, when it comes time to finding out what Samuel gets, he gets a piece of property, like 20 acres in Barbados. And when you start thinking about it, 20 acres of land in Barbados compared to all of that opportunity that his eldest son was getting, I think that we start to see a sense of loss of perspective of Samuel, that he's really trying to find out his way in life. And he's going to use that, I think, in all of the different ways that he continues to establish himself, whether it is, going to Boston and trying to open up, a wharf or a warehouse, and not meeting very good success with that. And then leaving the world of commerce and saying, okay, well, I couldn't do that, so I'm going to go and become a minister, which, by the way, is what his older brother was as well. His older brother was a minister also. And so here he comes to being a minister. And when he arrives in the village, as we might understand in various churches today, when there is a church that is in need of a pastor, that there is a process that is taken where the church will seek out a qualified applicant to fill the role for their ministerial services at the church. And then if there's a person who's looking for a church, they basically start to try to connect. And I think because of the failings of Samuel with getting the property or not getting the property that his son or his brother had gotten, I think his failings in business and in commerce kind of sets him up for this beginnings of a contract negotiation with the church and with himself, as far as how he's going to enter into the pastor. This church had just previously had a controversy with its former pastor, which is why he had left. So we already know that there's some conflict within the church. And Ray, one of the biggest conflicts before we start getting to the negotiations between Parris and the church is that the church was a little concerned about who could become a member and how they could become a member. And that would also impact Samuel's understanding of the church as well.
Yeah, Puritan churches were going through a lot of changes at this particular point. This is a time of social change in many ways. And the old Puritan churches, in order to become a member, you didn't just have to be baptized and go through all that. You also had to stand up and give a testimony of your conversion experience. You needed to demonstrate your conversion experience. You had to be accepted by the church. Becoming a church member, becoming a part of the church was not an easy thing to do. It's not like it is today where you walk an aisle, sign a card or whatever, and boom, you're a member of a church. It was a very difficult path to become a member of the church. And what was happening as time was going on and the number of Puritans were in the population getting smaller, the number of people who were members of churches began to shrink as well. And so the Puritans had to come up with a way to sort of keep the doors of the churches open, keep the rolls full. So they came up with something called the halfway covenant, which was basically, if you had been born in the church, you were baptized, maybe you weren't converted, but you could still be a member of the church as long as you kept yourself out of, too much scandalous behavior. There was some things you weren't allowed to do, but it was allowing you to at least stay on the rolls of the church. And that was a big controversy at this time. And something that Samuel Parris is actually going to get himself involved in with a little controversy once he comes into that church, because he's going to come into the Salem church with the old way of thinking. We've got to go back to the old way of membership and acceptance in the church, and we don't want this sort of halfway covenant stuff. So he he comes in trying to sort of tug things back to an old way. And of course, as you can imagine, Chris, there's two sides within that church. There are two sides within that village. And he's going to come in and he's going to make some waves when he does.
Yeah, they invite him to come and preach a trial sermon, and he preaches the trial sermon, and then the congregation kind of talks about what had taken place, what they think about Parris, and they basically said, yes, we like the guy. Let's go ahead and ask him to be our minister. So they go back to Parris and they say, hey, we'd like for you to be our minister. And this happens like on November the 15th, 1688, I think. And they do not hear from him until December 10th, 1688. And they're like, wait a second, it's been like over a month. The guy hasn't said whether he's interested or not. So they go back to him and said, hey, would you accept the office? Will you be our pastor? To which he said, and I quote from his writings, the work is weighty. You'll know in due time. So he keeps his silence for another 5 months. Now, Ray, in today's society, with the lack of patience among people today, I think it would be very hard for a preacher to go tell a church, I need about 6 months to be able to make a decision of whether or not I want to come and be a minister at your church. That's probably going to raise some bells and say, okay, maybe this is not going to be a good partnership, if you will. But they decided to wait. And so they gave him a few more months, and then they went to him again and they agreed. They agreed for an agreement. He was going to make, I think it was going to be like 60 pounds, and some of it's going to be money, some of it's in corn and others at different things. And Parris said, okay, we have an agreement, but there's a few other things I'd like to ask. And he draws up this 8-point document to the church that says, yes, I'll be your minister if you'll do step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And some of that was very interesting, to the point that he wanted firewood to be given to him freely and not taken out of his pay. But not only did he want the firewood to be given to him, but he wanted the actual members of the congregation to drop off the firewood at his doorstep, so he didn't have to go out there and collect it and do of all of those particular things. Once again, you would think the church might say, not interested, this isn't going to work. But they talk. They come to an agreement on the firewood. But then he says, hey, there's another thing. I'd like for you to deed over the parsonage. I want that to become my property and not the church's property. And the church is, once again, no, you can't do that. This is the church's property. But evidently, they really saw something in this guy, and they really, really liked him. So after some continued discussion and all, they said, okay, we will give you that. And so with a lot of agitation and with a lot of, just back and forth, finally, we find that on the date of, I think it was November 19th, 1689, Samuel Parris is ordained, and he gives his first sermon at that church. And the first sermon that he gives causes restlessness and quietness, because he starts bringing them back to the old traditional views, something that they were not very happy with.
Yeah, and I think there was also, when he started his ministry there were also people who saw an evangelical enthusiasm in him that maybe they weren't too terribly comfortable with as well. And, the way he went about his negotiations, where, as you said, he got the firewood, he got the parsonage, he got a barn, he wanted 2 acres of land. I mean, he milked that for all it was worth. He got everything out of that agreement that he could possibly get.
But Ray, just remember, I think it's important that we remember his failings from previous times in his life. I really think that he's using this opportunity, how bad it might be, that he's using the opportunity to prove himself that he is worthy of whatever it is in life. And, that maybe even though he's trying to preach a traditional view here, he's also kind of being hypocritical in it as well, because he's focused on what can benefit me the most by taking on a job and not necessarily taking on a calling.
Yeah, he's definitely making up for lost time, as we could say. There is no doubt about it. And of course, his position on his traditionalism, the overbearing way he entered into the contracts, this sort of evangelical enthusiasm he brings to the job, it's going to split the church. And like we mentioned earlier, Salem Village was a very divisive village. And the church at Salem Village that he was pastor over now was a very divisive church. And he knew that going in there. And there's going to ultimately be a dispute over the contract. They're going to stop, Chris. They're going to stop bringing the firewood to his house. They're going to say, we're not doing that anymore. So that's going to stop. And there's going to be a committee that's going to be put together. And he's going to end up in a deep dispute within the church, a division within the church. And what makes it even worse, Chris, is that he draws battle lines within the church. Instead of sort of being the peacemaker and sort of the person who's trying to pull everybody together, he starts drawing battle lines and talking about the ones who were opposed to him were wicked and reprobate and servants of the devil and all of this kind of stuff. And it's like he doesn't do what he needs to be doing, what he should be doing as a pastor.
Right. And where is he doing this? He's doing this every Sunday morning.
Yeah.
He's doing this in his sermons. When he is presenting the message that he says is coming from God, he is in one of his sermons or one of his writings, he actually complains of their rough and their irreverent behavior. He talks about the way that they scoff him, the way that they have a contemptuous tone in addressing him. So, I mean, he is literally calling them out from the pulpit. And I mean, we always talk about those sermons that kind of step on your toes. I mean, he's stepping on every body part of these individuals, and they are sitting there stone-faced thinking, we spent 7 months arguing with this guy to be our preacher, and look at what's happening.
Now he's insulting us. Yeah, that's not going to go over very well, especially in a community that's known for being very divisive and a church that's known for being very divided. But move forward a little bit. All this is going on in the community, the fighting within the church, and then it's winter of 1692, and one of his daughters, Elizabeth Parris, starts toying, we could say, with the occult. Her and a cousin, Abigail Williams, begin playing with fortune telling, really sort of maybe you could say innocent teenage girl type of stuff. What's my future husband going to be like? How much money is he going to make? The typical type of stuff. And other young girls in the community start getting involved in this. And of course, Chris, at this particular point in history, especially in Salem Village, Massachusetts, this was not considered harmless child's play. This was considered demonic activity. And so in January of 1692, Elizabeth, who at this point is only 9 years old, she begins to act in some very peculiar ways. Reports say that she barked like a dog. Her father would rebuke her. She would scream when she heard the Our Father prayer. Once she threw a Bible across a room. And then when the episode would end, she would cry and weep and talking about how she was condemned and all of that. And she actually, even at 9, went back and blamed some of this on her fortune telling, even at 9 years old. But this, Chris, is something that the people at the time, not just simply Elizabeth herself, 9-year-old Elizabeth, but other people at the time looked on as signs of demon possession, as signs of something very dark. But as we were talking before we started the program, there may have been some other explanations for what was going on here that the people of the time did not understand.
Yeah, I think there's two things to go on. The first thing is Cotton Mather had during this time just recently published a book that was called Memorable Providences. And it basically described witchcraft of an Irish lady in Boston, so just up the road. And some of the aspects of Betty's behavior kind of mirrored the person in the book. And this book had been widely read and widely discussed. So there was some talk that, well, maybe there's some acting that's going on here. But you also had the Indian War that was raging right across the river there. And so people knew that the devil was close at hand. You know, there was another possible explanation as to what was going on with Betty. And that came from an article that was done after some research in Science magazine in 1976 that said that she possibly had a disease that was known as convulsive ergotism. And that convulsive ergotism comes on because you ingest rye, which is something that Betty would have eaten as a cereal. It's a part of bread. And what happened is that the rye had been infected with ergo. And ergo is a fungus which develops inside the kernels of rye grain that comes because the rye has been under warm and damp conditions, which had been happening in the rye harvest in Salem during this time. And so by ingesting this, it would cause violent fits. It could create vomiting and also hallucinations. Mm-hmm. So just for our listeners to understand, LSD, that hallucinogenic drug, is a derivative of ergo. So I'm not trying to say that the 9-year-old was, hooked on acid or something like that. But what we are saying is that there are so many different things that could come out as to what was going on with Betty. But what happens is younger girls start picking up on it, start seeing the attention that young Betty is getting. And then all of a sudden there's Abby who starts trying to jump and fly into the air. And there's Ann Putnam and Mercy Lewis and Mary Walcott. And they start acting crazy and start having all of these different symptoms. And so the people in the church, first of all, start looking at the preacher and what's going on there, and then start looking at the war across the way, start thinking about the literature they've been reading. And they say, my gosh, the devil is in our midst and is at work.
Yeah, and they start an investigation, and young Elizabeth and Abigail and others are interrogated and asked who had bewitched them. And it was viewed really as a crime, that whoever was going to be accused by these young girls as bewitching them, it was going to be a crime. And so the girls start throwing out names, basically, and they throw out some names of some very, at first anyway, some very, we could say, unpopular women within the society, within Salem Village. You had Sarah Good, for example. She was accused of witchcraft. You have Sarah Osborne, who rarely attended church. And then you have Samuel Parris's slave, Tituba, who was a South American Indian lady from the West Indians. And of course, she had a lot of ethnic differences and was around the children, and of course was accused of being a witch. And many of the women, at least early on, who were accused of being witch were sort of outcasts in Salem Village. And they were people who, maybe, like I said, didn't fit the mold of what was expected of a good Puritan woman. They were single. They were self-directed people. They didn't do things the way the other people were doing them.
Yeah, and I think it's also, imperative that we look, and there were a lot of people that were investigating, trying to figure out what was going on. There was Mary Sibley. She proposed even like counter magic to the Parris families. I remember they had that. They had another Indian slave whose name was John, and I think John had married Tituba. And she told John that he needed to bake a rye cake. And as he baked that rye cake, he needed to insert Betty and Abigail's urine into the cake. And then they were to take that cake and feed the family dog. You think, why feed the family dog with urine from two girls and a rye cake? But the whole thing about the dog is that dogs were believed to be used by witches as agents to basically carry out all of these commands. And the cake didn't work, and that really made Parris mad, and he got mad with Sibley and basically said it's going to the devil for help against the devil. So all of this is really just starting to boil over, and it's just not one thing. I think it's multiple things that are starting to happen. There is some family drama going on in this as well, with the Putnams. And so what leads to the Salem Witch Trials is just horrendous, because it was everything but what it really should have been about.
Yeah, Samuel Parris himself, once the trials begin, he becomes an active member of the trials, both submitting complaints against people, most likely people who were opposed to him in the community and in the church. He becomes a witness against many of those people, which of course is certainly a conflict of interest. Here's the guy who's brought the complaint. He's going to act as a key witness against them. And even sometimes he would be the person taking the minutes of the trial, the minutes of the meeting. So, he certainly placed himself right there in the center of this. And while all of this is going on, Chris, he is continuing his mission in the church there of publicly and in sermons derailing everyone who disagrees with him, everyone who opposes him. And so he takes a very active role, not simply in the fact that this all sort of started in his household, and it all sort of started shortly after he became the minister there in Salem Village, but he also takes an active role in the trials themselves. And of course, what started out as being, something that was just sort of targeting the outcast women of Salem Village, it soon got into the mainstream of Salem Village, where people who were not outcast were being women who were not outcast were being subject to being accused of being witches. And so it quickly got out of control, and upstanding citizens began being accused.
Yes, and we're focusing on the lead up to the trial, because many people are familiar with the trial, but you just have to ask yourself, the ultimate result of Tituba basically confessing to something that maybe she never even really did. So for Parris and his supporters, and I think the spring and the summer of 1692, I think it taught him a lot of things. I think it first of all taught him that he didn't have to pretend to be someone that he wasn't. I think it also taught him that a good society, a perfect society, or maybe that society that had been envisioned, this utopia, it wouldn't be achieved on this earth. And that I think it allowed him to really start moving forward and understanding his relationship with Christ even more, but also just who he was as an individual. I find it interesting that in the summer of 1693, after kind of the trial and things of that nature, on August 6th, he preached a sermon. He preached a sermon on the death of Christ. And I find that as he talked about that, and I just want to share this as I close my part, but this is what he said. He said, quote, "Come hither then," as he invited the congregation, "and see him as the most lively picture set forth as crucified before your eyes." And as I think about that, you have to wonder if Samuel Parris must have been imagining that he himself was one of the ones who had actually murdered Christ, who had taken the whole aspect of religion and really done something bad with it instead of doing something good with it. And I wonder if that moment, after having seen all that happened, if that was not probably the best sermon that he had preached, because in that sermon, he was psychologically, politically, and also personally saying, I'm confessing I've done wrong.
Yeah. And by the end of the trial that he was involved with, as we've already said, more than 150 witches, people accused of witchcraft and had been jailed, and 19 people had been hanged because they refused, I guess, to confess that they were witches, and others had been pressed to death as well. And as far as Samuel Parris himself is concerned, he's going to remain at the Salem church until 1697. And his wife is going to die the previous year in 1696. And he's going to move to Stowe, Massachusetts, where he becomes a preacher as well. He's also going to work as a retailer there in Stowe. He's going to remarry, and they're going to have 4 additional children on top of that. And he's going to live until February 27, 1720, where he dies at Sudbury, Massachusetts. So, Chris, thanks for another great episode. If you'd like to contact us, you can contact us by email at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. You can find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Sounder FM, and we're also on Facebook and Twitter. We hope you will look us up on any of those platforms. Listen, share, and comment as you see fit. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.